10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Hello and welcome to 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. My name is Joe. I'm the host, and thank you for being here. And quickly, before we get started, if you are new and you have not subscribed to this podcast, let me encourage you to do that. When you subscribe to this podcast, you get all the episodes as soon as they are released. You don't have to search for the podcast every time you want to listen to it. It's always right there and ready for you to listen. Also, make sure you're connected with 10-Minute Murder on social media. The two main ones I use, Facebook and Instagram. And the point of that is to let you know, number one, when new episodes are released, and two, to see the visuals that go along with the stories that we're talking about. It's not always necessary, but for instance, in like today's episode, I'm going to be describing the appearance of the killer. He transformed himself in a way that is really different, and you're going to want to see what this looks like. So you can go to Facebook or Instagram, type in 10-Minute Murder into the search bar, and it'll pop right up. Or you can click the link in the show notes of this episode, and it'll take you right to 10-Minute Murder on social media. Now, let's get to today's story. Pazuzu Algarad's House of Horror. Now, as you might have already guessed, Pazuzu Algarad's original name was not Pazuzu. He was born John Alexander Lawson to an average American family on August 12, 1978, in San Francisco, California. His parents, Cynthia and Timothy Lawson, divorced in 1990. Thus, Pazuzu grew up in the care of his mother in Clements, North Carolina, where they moved. There's not a lot of information available about Pazuzu's early years, but as a child, Pazuzu was described as highly emotional and violent. At age 13, he started drinking alcohol and using different drugs, whatever drugs he could get his hands on, and he continuously harmed animals. Pazuzu was eventually diagnosed with severe mental illness, including schizophrenia and agoraphobia, which you probably have heard is where you don't want to leave the house. You have a fear of being in situations where escape might be difficult. Cynthia tried to help her son as much as she possibly could, but eventually she ran out of money and couldn't afford the treatments anymore. And so, Pazuzu's psychiatric visits stopped. Pazuzu had previously told psychiatrists that he'd been practicing the Sumerian religion that involved the monthly satanic ritual and animal sacrifices that were a part of that. His mother was scared that if she did not allow these rituals, which he called dark moon sacrifices, at their home, Pazuzu would kill himself. Despite her son's very dark and alarming actions, Cynthia had later said, quote, "He wasn't by any means an angel, but he wasn't a bad person or a boogeyman or whatever phrases they've called him." However, Pazuzu clearly wanted to make himself appear as scary looking as possible. He enjoyed making others feel uncomfortable around him. So first in 2002, he legally changed his name from John Lawson to Pazuzu Algarad. The name was inspired by the movie The Exorcist and its Mesopotamian demon. Next, Pazuzu started to change his appearance. He sharpened his teeth using one of those Dremel sanding tools. He split his tongue to look like a snake, and he tattooed his face. His psychiatrist once noted that Pazuzu had told him he only bathed once a year and never brushed his teeth. His reasoning was that personal hygiene, quote, stripped the body of its defenses in warding off infection and illness. As little as Pazuzu cared about taking care of himself, he cared even less about the house that he shared with his mother on Nob Hill Drive. The home had become a hangout place for society's outcasts and misfits after Pazuzu had decided to start a new religion that mixed Luciferianism and Islam and invited everybody to join. His followers grew by the day. Before long, you could find them doing drugs, drinking alcohol, committing self-harm, drinking blood from birds, sacrificing animals, and participating in ritualistic orgies in Pazuzu's house. And as nobody had any interest in cleaning after themselves, you can just imagine how filthy the place started to be. There were literal piles of garbage, animal feces, and carcasses everywhere, in addition to bottles of alcohol. The walls were filled with satanic symbols and smeared with blood. And if that was not enough, Pazuzu himself and his followers, copying him, defecated in the corners of the house. Eventually, the neighbors and everyone else started to notice a terrible smell. Somebody even asked Pazuzu about his house's foul odor. Pazuzu claimed he had killed people and buried them in his backyard. But, of course, at the time, most people thought he was lying. Nobody initially took him seriously. In hindsight, a big mistake. On May 28, 2010, Pazuzu's mother was the target of one of her son's violent outbursts. Cynthia was put in a chokehold by her son. Amber Birch, Pazuzu's girlfriend, was accused of slapping and attempting to beat Cynthia even further. In court documents of the case, officers alleged that Pazuzu performed satanic rituals and animal sacrifices at the Clements home. But that was that. Pazuzu was convicted of misdemeanor assault, and Amber was not charged at all. A year earlier, Pazuzu had been arrested in connection with the death of Joseph Emmerich Chandler, who was then 30 years old, in Clements. Joseph's body had been found in the Yadkin River, the same river where Pazuzu practiced black magic rituals. In the end, he was convicted of accessory after the fact of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to probation in 2012. Another man, Nicholas Pasquale Rizzi, was convicted of the act itself. After his convictions, Pazuzu was of interest to the police more than ever, and they kept a close eye on him. They had previously investigated the backyard of Pazuzu's Nob Hill house in 2010 after a tip from a woman named Stacy Carter saying her boyfriend's body was buried behind the house. However, due to some excellent and thorough police work at that time, they did not find anything. What did they miss? Just some shallow graves containing skeletal remains. However, on October 5th, 2014, Pazuzu's luck ended when another search warrant was executed and graves were finally uncovered. The funny thing is, you can clearly see where the graves were openly located in Pazuzu's backyard from the pictures taken in 2014, 4 years after the first search, like he wasn't even trying to hide them. The victims found in the graves behind Pazuzu's house were later identified as Joshua Frederick Wetzler and Tommy Dean Welch. They had been buried for 5 years before their discovery. Allegedly, Pazuzu had abducted both men for human sacrifices in July and October 2009, respectively. Joshua had been chained in the basement without food for several days before Pazuzu shot him 6 times, killing him. A few months later, Tommy had the same fate, but this time, the one holding the gun was Amber. Investigation revealed that the body was left to lay inside the residence for over 2 weeks before they buried it. Nobody probably even noticed as the house smelled like death already anyway. Pazuzu, then 35 years old, and his wife Amber, who was 24, were arrested and charged with murder. The two were not legally married, but they had written on their Facebook pages that they had been married since November 1st, 2009. So they were Facebook official, so that counts. Another female follower who was also involved in the polyamorous relationship with Pazuzu and Amber, Crystal Matlock, then 28 years old, was arrested the following day and charged with accessory after the fact. Soon after the remains were found and the three were in custody, county housing officials deemed the house unfit for human habitation. The home simply was beyond any possibility of renovation, which was not a surprise to anybody who had ever been inside, even for a moment. So in April 2015, Pazuzu Algarad's House of Horrors was demolished. During the trial, Amber claimed that she suffered a form of Stockholm Syndrome and had no choice but to participate in the murders. Still, on March 9, 2017, Amber Birch took a plea deal of second-degree murder, armed robbery, and accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years in prison with a maximum of 39 years and 2 months. June 5, 2017, Crystal Matlock pleaded guilty to conspiracy to accessory after the fact of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to a minimum of 3 years with a maximum of 4 years and 10 months in prison for her part in the burial of the bodies. Following his arrest, Pazuzu was moved to Central Prison in Raleigh in May 2015 on a safekeeping order because of his mental health issues. Psychiatrists interviewed him to determine whether he was even capable of standing trial. During the interview, it was confirmed that he suffered from schizophrenia, agoraphobia, and alcoholism, and his physical health was not the best. Still, it was said that Pazuzu treated his conditions with medications and seemed fit to aid his own defense. However, we would never hear what Pazuzu had to say for himself. On October 25th, 2015, around 3 a.m., Pazuzu was found unresponsive in his cell with blood pouring from an open wound on his arm. He had been scheduled to appear in court the next day, but despite resuscitation attempts, Pazuzu was pronounced dead at 4:20 a.m. He died of severe blood loss, but it's never been clear what instrument he used to make the wound on his arm. Some have even argued that there was not enough evidence to say whether his death was even a suicide to begin with. One theory that looks very likely, even though there's not enough evidence to say for sure, is that Pazuzu committed suicide by biting open his forearm and bleeding out. He had mentioned doing this in the past, and he had those sharpened, pointy teeth. In 2019, Viceland's documentary The Devil You Know was published. The director and producer of the documentary, Patricia Gillespie, wanted to learn the truth behind the self-proclaimed Satanist Pazuzu. After everything she saw and despite his obnoxious behavior, Patricia refuses to condemn Pazuzu as an evil person, saying, quote, "Of course, Pazuzu and Amber actually shot and killed these people, but there were many points at which someone could have interceded. We, as a community, sort of messed that up." And I think Patricia is somewhat right. A big portion of that has to be personal accountability, but often those most in need are left alone. They don't get the treatment that they need if they have some sort of mental illness, and often the police don't take action early enough. But still, we can only guess if proper intervention would have been enough, and if John would have ever become Pazuzu Algarad. That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Thanks for listening today. And quickly, let me be clear. I'm in no way, shape, or form on the side of Pazuzu. He was a vile human being that did awful things and wrecked whole families. What I am saying is we don't take mental health seriously enough. There are many people suffering, and we, for the most part, kind of look the other way. What I am saying is if he had gotten the help that he needed early on, then maybe this would have never happened. That's what I'm saying. But I mean, maybe it would have happened. Maybe this was just the way he was. We don't know. And hey, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, if you are new here, then make sure you're subscribed before you go today. If you are subscribed, be sure to follow on social media, Facebook or Instagram, probably both. At the time these words are coming out of my mouth, I think we have close to 3,000 on Facebook, and that's where I make the majority of the 10-Minute Murder posts. The photos go to both places, but on Facebook I share additional stories about just different things that happen around in the country and the world, just different things in true crime that are of interest to me that I assume would be of interest to you as well. So Facebook and Instagram, the show notes of this episode have the links to that, or you can just search in the search bar of either one of those. Type 10-Minute Murder and it'll pop right up. And thank you for listening. Have a good night.